Hello and welcome to episode 99, The Making of an Intelligence Officer and Recruiting Assets. So, we have had several of the former intelligence officers on this podcast previously who have discussed various aspects of the field intelligence, primarily looking after the covert operations, the kind of impact it has on the international relations, politics, the space industry, and several other aspects too. But today we'll be looking at a different angle of how the root of this whole sector is, what goes behind making of such talented people in this sector. Because it doesn't matter which country you come from, but being an intelligence officer is something that those sharp-minded people are only chosen in this sector. So without any delay, I would like to welcome Mr. James Lawler. Hi, James. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm Kari. I'm pleased to be here.
Thank you very much, and thank you for firstly taking out the precious time. I have been reading your post. I have seen your book publishing as well. So this is, I would say, for me, this is a very big moment, and that's the reason we kept it this episode as locking in as the 99 and the 100 episodes. We are finishing the 100 episodes, and I think this is an icing on the cake for the people who listen to this podcast every month. So, yeah, I mean, before we take a deep dive into this topic, can you briefly first tell us about yourself? Because I believe your personal journey has been very interesting, looking at the kind of things that you have done, even the kind of, book publishing that you're doing at the moment as well. So, can you briefly introduce about the things about yourself and, how you ended up doing what you're doing at the moment?
It's kind of a funny story. I backed into this career almost by accident. I was in law school at the University of Texas way back in 1976. And like any student who's in their last year of graduate school or law school, there's only one thing on your mind, and that's finding a job. And the CIA was coming to our university, the University of Texas, and they were going to try and recruit some attorneys for the CIA's Office of General Counsel. Because, like any large organization, the CIA has to have attorneys to keep it out of trouble, or in the CIA's case, sometimes to get it out of trouble. And so I went to this interview. I was just curious. I needed a job. So I went to this interview and I met this gentleman named Mr. Bill Wood. And Mr. Wood and I spoke together for only a couple of minutes when he interrupted and he said, "Jim, have you ever considered the clandestine service?" And I looked at him and I said, "I don't know what the clandestine service is." And he said, "Well, I can't tell you much about it, but I think you'd be really good at this." So that piqued my curiosity. And I took an application home that night with me and thought about it. But then the cold reality kind of entered into my plans. And that reality consisted of the fact that my new wife, her mother, was very ill, and that there was no chance that she and I would be moving to Washington, D.C., and then thousands of miles overseas. That wasn't going to happen as long as her mother was very sick. So the next day, I returned the application to Mr. Wood and simply said, "The timing is just not right at the moment." So instead of going to work for the CIA in 1976, I went into a family business. And I don't know if you or many of your listeners have ever been in a family business before, but if you're no longer in the family business, it's probably because of the F word, family. And I, I love my brothers who were in the business and my dad, but frankly, Amkar, it was very meaningless. We were manufacturing steel components for metal buildings, and it's an honorable profession, but just making money was not very meaningful to me. And I was making a lot of money, to be honest. In fact, I was making more money than I'd ever make again in the rest of my life. But I was very dissatisfied with what I was doing. It just was, to me, it was meaningless. And so I would come home at night frequently complaining about what a terrible day, how I hated my job, things like that. And after about 3.5 years, my wife finally looked at me and she said, "Jim,
Yeah.
either do something about it or stop your belly aching, stop your bitching and moaning." And so I thought, well, that's very good advice. Now, by this time, sadly, her mom had passed away. So there was no longer any restraint on us staying in Houston, Texas, where we were. So I went and I found Mr. Wood's card and I wrote him a letter that night and explained that when he and I had spoken 3.5 years earlier, that the timing had not been right. But now I would really like to pursue the opportunity that he was extending to me. I mailed that letter. 3 days later, I received a phone call at my office, and a young woman said, Mr. Wood received your letter and was wondering if you could meet him at the Holiday Inn Hotel out on the Gulf Freeway next Thursday at noon, and he'll meet you in the lobby. I said, sure. So I went to this meeting, and he met me. We went to his room. We talked for about 2 hours, and he said, I'd like to fly you to Washington and for some testing in a couple of weeks. So I flew to Washington for about 3 days worth of testing. Then I came back, and about 3 months later, they invited me to come back for a second round of testing. And this consisted what we call the polygraph test. Some people call it a lie detector test, which it is not. It's a stress detector. But they're looking to see if you have any skeletons in your closet, if you have any counterintelligence issues they should be aware of, or legal issues they should be aware of. And I passed that fine. And then I had to talk to the psychiatrists and psychologists, the shrinks. Not sure how I got through that. Not sure how I got through that, but I did.
Yes.
And flew back to Texas. And about 3 or 4 weeks later, a young lady called me up and she said, Mr. Lawler, we'd like to offer you a job as a CIA operations officer. Now, the bizarre thing, Amkar, I had no idea about this job they were offering me, CIA operations officer. It's also known as a case officer. But I really didn't care. I wanted to get out of Houston, away from this hot and humid climate, away from a job I couldn't stand. And so, I mean, literally, I would have taken a job, shoveling manure on the planet Neptune just to get out of town and get away from that. And so, my wife and
Mm.
I, we packed up our bags. She was pregnant with our first child, and we drove to Washington. And on February 19th, 1980, I started my job as a CIA operations officer or case officer. And then I found out exactly what they expected me to do. And to be very blunt about it, the CIA operations officer is expected to manipulate people, to exploit people, to suborn people, to subvert people, to convince them to commit espionage, to become traitors to their countries or to their organizations. And I found out that not only was I pretty good at it, but I enjoyed the hell out of it. And that's that's what they refer
Yeah.
to as the almost the sociopathic part of being a case officer. In fact, I
Yes.
had a good friend of mine who's a psychiatrist. He said, Lawler,
Yes.
you're nothing but a sociopath, but one within lanes. Those lanes are U.S. laws. We don't break U.S. laws. So, no, and I had a great 25-year career as a CIA operations officer. I
Yeah.
enjoyed virtually every minute of it. In fact, I tell young people, I said, how many of you would like to have a job where 19 mornings out of 20 you cannot wait to get to work? And I said, that's what my job
Yeah.
was like. I mean, and even on the 20th morning, it wasn't that I dreaded going to work. It's just, well, okay, every month there might be one day where I'm not feeling that great. But
Yes.
literally 19 mornings out of 20, I loved it. I'm a like a lot of case officers. I suffer a bit from what we call attention deficit disorder, ADHD, attention deficit disorder. But the problem is, or the thing is in the CIA as an operations officer, you're never bored. It's always a new ball
Yes.
game, almost every day, and I love that.
Yes. That's interesting. And, I mean, like you have mentioned the way you entered the intelligence service. So, can you also tell us about your, in general, as a journey as an intelligence officer? I mean, of course, anything that can be put up in the public, I mean, how the experience was in general, because you mentioned about the fact that you used to recruit the assets on ground for
Right.
for the CIA. So can you briefly tell us how was your journey as a intelligence officer?
Sure. I spent about 2.5 years after coming to Washington in training. We have our clandestine training course where they teach us a lot about how to recruit an asset. Although I'll be very straight with you and tell you that most really good case officers are natural recruiters to begin with. They know how to communicate and they know how to win the trust of people and they know how to, empathize with people. And we can go into some of the qualities of a good case officer a little later in the program, but they teach you things like surveillance detection to make sure you're not under the surveillance of a hostile intelligence service. They teach you how to communicate with your clandestine assets. They teach you how to hold a meeting and how to write an intelligence report. And then the things about some of the priorities at CIA, and also some of the things you shouldn't do. And so
Yes.
that was about a 4 or 5 month training course. And then I was scheduled to go to a country where they needed French language. I needed French language, and so I went to 6 months of French language training. We hire a lot of people who already have good languages, and so that's great. But I had had some Spanish when I was growing up, and I didn't really want to go to Latin America. Although it turned out that most of my friends overseas on my first tour were all from Latin America, and but I was put into a French course. And so after 2.5 years, then I was sent on my first operational tour overseas. And we had five consecutive tours overseas. I spent 12 consecutive years overseas working as a case officer. I went overseas as a GS 11, which is approximately equivalent to, I think, like a lieutenant, maybe a captain. And I came back as a GS 15, which is equivalent to a colonel. So in 1994, we came home and back to CIA headquarters. And I spent the next 11 years running a program trying to uh, control the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. In other words, trying to prevent countries who did not have nuclear or biological or chemical weapons from obtaining that technology. And I found that to be a very satisfying part of my career. When you can basically disarm a country and take away its nuclear weapons, that's really meaningful. In fact, that's what I call
Yes.
something psychologically righteous.
Interesting. And just coming to the actual, I would say, little bit of the training part, because this question is something that I always get asked for on the platforms, my podcast as well as on the LinkedIn whenever I publish something related to the intelligence officers. So, can you walk us through the typical training process for becoming an intelligence officer, and primarily what are the key skills and traits intelligence agencies look for in potential recruits for intelligence officer roles?
Sure. Well, the training program is, trying to ensure that the operations officer, that the employee knows how to prioritize his time, how to protect the covert assets that we recruit. That's our highest goal, is to always protect the people that we are recruited or that we're handling. If I'm the recruiting officer and I become the handling officer, meaning I am directing the
Yes.
covert asset, what kind of intelligence we need, how to do it, how to stay safe. And so we get that kind of training at our training facility, which is known as the farm. And it is in a rural part of the country. It really is like a farm. It's very, very relaxing there. But you learn how to budget your time. You learn how to make sure that you're safe, make sure that your covert asset is safe, how to, as I said earlier, how to write an intelligence report, what's important, what's not important, how to
Yes.
write an operational cable. A cable is a message, an encrypted message back to headquarters, how to do all that properly, and how to prioritize your time and how to go after people, how to spot a target who is of interest. And sometimes it's intuitively obvious. If I meet a Russian or a Chinese intelligence officer, we know that that person would be of importance. But it becomes kind of blurry, kind of condensed, very confusing if you're not exactly sure where somebody fits in a program. Take a nuclear program, for instance. You'd be amazed at the type of people that we are interested in a nuclear weapons program. Some of them you would think, why would we care about that? For instance, someone who has a specialty in health physics. You think, well, what do we care about the health of these people? Well, it's because the health physics officer knows exactly where all of the nuclear weapons are stored, the fissile material. That's very important for us to know that. And so we try and teach people how to talk to people, like how to talk to a scientist, even though you're not a scientist, or
Yeah.
how to get somebody to be interested in you. Because half the battle is not only finding the target, but then getting the target to allow or to want to spend time with you, to become friends, to build that foundation of trust, which is the essential core of any kind of relationship, be it a romantic relationship or a friendship or an intelligence relationship. You have to have that trust. And the asset has to trust you, and you have to trust the asset. Now, Amkar, you asked me what are the qualities that we look for in an
Yes.
employee. Now, I'm going to give you my own Jim Lawler's personal 10 things that I think every case officer should have or should have this in their tool chest and be natural about this. Number one is I think people need to be curious, meaning you have to have
Yeah.
a certain amount of curiosity. You want to talk to somebody, and I would do this even before I became a case officer. I was always curious about people. Secondly, very important is keen listening ability. You don't recruit people when you're talking. You recruit people when you're listening,
Listening.
and
Yes.
absolutely listening and finding out what makes them tick. That leads to my third quality, extreme empathy. In order to recruit someone, I need to get inside their head and feel what it's like to be them, to find out what the stresses in their life is. Because you don't recruit happy people, you recruit unhappy people, people who are
Yes.
under stress. And sometimes that can take a long time. In one case, it took me 11 years to recruit one target because for the first 10 and a half years, he and I were friends and everything, but he was on top of the world. He was single. He was part of the ruling ethnic group in his country. He had money. He had a nice little car. He was a very happy person, very healthy and happy. And
Yeah.
he really didn't need me that much. We were close. We shared a hobby, and that hobby was long distance running. He and I both are runners. Now, he was about 10 years younger than me, and he was also a world class runner, and I'm not. But we would go running every Saturday,
Yeah.
and we got to be very, I mean, literally, genuinely very good friends, close friends. So close that even after I moved away from the country where we were both living, he wrote to me and said, Jim, I'm engaged to be married, and I'd like you to be my best man. So I flew back to this country where we had been living, and I was his best man at the wedding. And the night before the wedding occurred, I kind of hinted that if he ever needed me, that he and I were like brothers and he could trust me because I had special
Yeah.
connections in Washington and I could help him out. I didn't come out and say I'm CIA, but I hinted a little bit that I had special connections. Well,
Okay.
life went on, and several years later, he had moved to a third world country and had taken his new wife there. And she discovered that being far from home and in a third world country was not to her liking. And they had had a baby by then, but she was so upset, she took the baby, she divorced him, and she flew home to her home country. So his world psychologically was falling apart.
Yes.
And divorce is one of those ultimately very stressful situations where psychologically, emotionally, and financially you're really in trouble. So he's going through that turmoil, and then he gets sent back to his home country. And in the years that he had been gone, a lot had changed. His ethnic group was no longer the ruling class in his country. And he was very frustrated. And he told me, he said, Jim, I could work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and I'll never be promoted again. There's a glass ceiling. and I can't get through it. How can someone who's treated like that give allegiance to that country? So I wrote him and I said, listen, I know you're going to visit your wife in her home country to see your daughter. You're going to go visit your ex wife. I just happen to have a trip planned through that part of the world. Why don't we have a little talk about business opportunities? And so I met him. It took me about 30 seconds to do what we call breaking cover, meaning I admit that I'm really a CIA officer. And I told him, I'd like you to join my team. And he said, Jim, you've given me something to believe in. So that recruitment took
Yes.
11 years, but he loved working for us. And he basically went back to his home country after being recruited. And it was during 9/11. He said that told me later that he was watching the television when those twin towers crashed. And he said, I became very emotional. And my colleagues were wondering, why are you so upset? You're not an American. And he said, well, what they don't understand is I'm now on your team. And so
Yes.
he had transferred his allegiance to America and to my team. He went on to have a very successful career with us, and he went into business for himself. And today he has a very successful business. And he said one of his regrets is that he doesn't have a picture of me that he could put up in the business, and the caption would be "Our founder."
That's
So
interesting.
yeah. So anyway, so empathy, patience. I just talked about patience. You have to
Yes.
be a patient person. It took me 11 years. Okay.
Yes.
Persistence. You have to be persistent. Some of the some of the recruitment pitches that I've given that have failed have been because I was not persistent enough. I didn't go back and try again and try again. Sometimes it takes, somebody doesn't really say no, but they don't say yes. So if you're a little bit more persistent and a little bit more focused, then that's also a quality. Another quality that we can always value is creativity, being creative. I mean, really.
Interesting.
Then being a careful observer of stressors in people's lives. It takes time. I used to be a rock climber, climbing, go climbing. And the way you climb a rock is you look for the crack system. You don't
Yes.
climb bald rock. You have to look for the crack
Yes.
system where you put your fingers and toes so you can climb that rock. And people are like that too. Over time, I can study and find out what your emotional, psychological crack system is because
Oh,
everybody's got it. Everybody's got a crack system.
yes.
Then the eighth quality is going to sound very harsh. I call it ruthlessness. Now that really sounds harsh. But by
Yes.
that, by that I mean never forgetting why you're doing this. That you're not taking this person out for fancy meals at restaurants just to be their friend. You are trying to recruit that person to be an intelligence source. And the mediocre to poor case officer fears rejection. Well, I tell my students when I'm teaching these courses in tradecraft, I said, if you've never had a pitch turned down, you haven't pitched enough people. You have to always be
Yes.
probing, and you have to not fear rejection
Yes.
or not fear offending the person. If I'm working that person and they say to me, Jim, then that's all you wanted was to for me to betray my country and give you these secrets. Well, that's a risk you run, but you try and approach it to where it's softer than that, and that it's a team building, that you're helping one another as friends. Then
Absolutely.
another quality is having a powerful or persuasive personality. I'm not sure how I can teach somebody to do that. I know when I meet somebody who's like that, but that's
Yes.
the kind of thing that I'm not sure that we can train. I can take somebody who's rather poor or mediocre and bring them up to a certain point. But if I meet somebody who's naturally charismatic and has strong interpersonal skills, I can take that person up really high.
Yes.
And then the final quality is a rather mystical quality that I refer to as the metaphysics. And the metaphysics is a term that I've coined. It's not really the metaphysics in philosophy, but it's a metaphysical quality that a top class case officer has when he or she is pitching a target. It's as if you and the target are in another dimension, another plane of existence, and there's nothing around you that would distract you. You're almost like you have a mental hook into that person's brain, and you are convincing them to become a spy, to work for
Yes.
you. And it's got some bit of hypnosis, a bit of, but it's more than that. It's more than it's the tone of voice. It's literally some metaphysical quality that only a small percentage of case officers have. And when it's going like this, I tell you, Amkar, it's like time doesn't exist. Time dilates. It's just you and then the target,
Yes.
and you're getting them to just do what you want them to do.
Yeah.
And so that's what I call the metaphysics. In fact, I've written about it in a couple of my novels. So those are the qualities that I think are important for a good intelligence officer, especially a case officer. When I use the term intelligence officer, that applies not only
Yes.
to case officers, but also to all the other people who support intelligence operations or who analyze the intelligence when we send it back to CIA headquarters. They're the ones who write up all of the finished intelligence and send it to all of our consumers, be it the president or the National Security Council, or it could be State Department, or it could be the Treasury. So you that's a broad term, intelligence officers. I am a case officer. That's a subset of the intelligence officers.
Yes.
There are other people who we call the collection management officers. They're the ones who write the requirements and who tell the case officers, okay, here's what we need to know about, say, the nuclear weapons program in Iran. Then we have another
Yes.
class of officers called the targeting officers, and they can tell us here's what we know about, say, again, the Iranian nuclear weapons program and these particular scientists. Here are the scientists who travel outside of Iran because we're not going to be approaching people inside of Iran. But if we can meet them at a conference or a trade show or a scientific symposium, here's what we know about that person. Maybe we've had some contact with them in the past. Maybe we know that they have a cousin in the U.S. or they have some affinity for people in the U.S. Maybe we know that they're going through marital problems. Maybe we know a lot of things, that they're about these people, that they have certain needs. So those are targeting officers, and they would give me, the case officer, here's what we know about this professor so and so. Then we have some other officers as well. We have linguists who specialize in languages and who can do the translation for some hard languages. A lot of case officers do speak foreign languages, and that's
Yes.
always good. That's always great. If you have at least one foreign language, that's very helpful.
Interesting. And before I jump to the next question, can you tell us what is the difference between the real and the real life while recruiting the intelligence officers? The way they show it in the movies, especially the Hollywood films, and how the real life is different. I mean, it's a fun question, so yeah, you can answer it at your pace.
Well, the intelligence operations that I've been involved with take a lot of time. And
Yeah.
you can't have that kind of time. You compress in a movie or even in a book. You compress the time scale because everybody would fall asleep if we did it at real time. it was, it was,
That's true. I can understand.
you just don't.
Yeah, yeah.
It doesn't happen just
Yes.
like this. Um,
Yeah.
Now, you could ask me, have you ever pitched somebody that you've never met? That's called a cold
Yeah.
pitch. And a cold pitch is where you know that someone has access to sensitive information, classified information or
Yeah.
something, or they have a sensitive position, but you've never met that person before. Now, the chances that you can recruit that person in one meeting is very slim unless you know a lot about that person. That
Yes.
other officers, other case officers have been around the person. They've written down things. They know that this person is going through some kind of stress. Well, that's
Yeah.
great. That increases your chances of recruiting the person on a cold pitch. But usually the goal of a cold pitch is not the recruitment in that meeting, but it's getting the next meeting, the second meeting, getting what I call the getting the next date. you know,
Yeah.
it's unusual if you're dating that you're going to get lucky on that first date. No, you you look for the second or third date, and you're
Yes.
trying to get them to meet you again. To
Yeah.
be interested in you and want to meet you again. And so
Yeah.
that takes experience. That takes a way to basically you become a shape shifter. You become what that
Yes.
person needs. And I get tired of case officers who say, "Well, my cover doesn't fit." And I say, "Well, make it fit. Come on, be creative. What does that person
Yeah.
need? Become what they need, and be flexible. Don't be so wedded
Yeah.
to a single cover that's inflexible." So, anyways, doing planning an approach that is not threatening. You don't want to threaten people.
Yes.
To me, in fact, there's an acronym we use in the intelligence business. It's MICE, MICE, MICE. M stands for money. I never recruited anybody only for money. Very few people are recruited only for money. Now you may have money in the equation, but people do it for other reasons. The I in mice is ideology. You occasionally will recruit somebody who can't stand the political system in their country, or who really believe in our political system, or maybe they believe that their country shouldn't have nuclear or biological weapons, and that's an ideological
Yes.
motivation. And you occasionally get that. C in mice stands for coercion. Some countries, such as the Russians and the Chinese, or maybe the Iranians, will use coercion to coerce people, either through blackmail or physical intimidation, into working for them. Now, the CIA has occasionally used coercion. I won't deny that. But I don't like it at all. And it's not for a moral reason. It's because I don't want to be driving down the street with a rattlesnake in the back seat. I want people to be positively motivated to work for me and to trust me. I can't trust somebody who's operating under coercion. And then the final element of MICE is the E, and that stands for ego. And I'd say that 99% of our recruitments are really centered on ego. The person has a need, a person has gambling debts, a person has a mistress, and all these things are ego centric. A person may have elder care issues. Their parents are elderly and have health issues. So they may have a child who has a health issue, and so these are motivations that we look for and try to answer.
Interesting. Yep. I mean, I'd like to share this fact actually. Uh, Generally, I don't share so many things about the personal stuff, but yeah, you mentioned about the dating. So, a connection between the intelligence and the dating. I think this is the first time someone has given this kind of analogy, and I believe my girlfriend always tries to tell me, how the dating is done, or it was done basically, because I have personally never dated, so I never had an experience. But this is a great analogy that you mentioned about, the intelligence and the dating. Like, on the first go, you don't get it basically. So yeah, I mean, moving towards our actual question from this. So what types of real world scenarios are used in training to prepare recruits for intelligence operations? I mean, I'll be very glad if you give such fun examples about dating as well.
Well, there are elements of
Yeah.
romance or seduction. I mean, there's certain
Yes.
analogy to seduction, seducing someone not for sexual pleasure,
Yes.
but for to get them to give you something that they shouldn't be giving you, that they
Yeah.
trust you and they want to give it to you. That's a challenge, but it's something I was pretty good at. Now, as far as the training, we would construct a artificial um, country, a country that does, it's a hypothetical country. And your job was to maybe recruit some of the people in this country. We had instructors who role played as officials of this so-called foreign country, and you would meet them somehow. First, you have to learn how to what we call bumping someone. Basically, you'd be at a cocktail party or a dinner party, and you meet someone who you should know is of operational interest, and then you introduce yourself and then give them some plausible reason why they should meet you away from this venue. Maybe I told you earlier, I met a guy that we shared an interest in long distance running. Well, what I did was when I got to this country where I was assigned, I just looked in the diplomatic list to see who had been recently assigned, just like me. And I found out that there was a young man who had arrived within a week of me. And so I just cold called this guy. He was from a country where we needed intelligence sources. I cold
Yeah.
called him, explained that I had just arrived a few days before him. And since we were both newcomers, how would you like to have lunch? And he said, sure. So we go to lunch, and then we just explored some of our common interests and hobbies. And both of us turned out to be long distance runners. So I said, why don't we go running? Here's where I live, and there's some nice running trails near my house. He thought that was a great idea. So then that led to extended, conversations, building the trust, building the friendship. Sometimes it's a little more artificial, like we know somebody is of high interest, and maybe we've had some other colleagues report on somebody saying, this guy was is really a key official and has access to a lot of things, but the our colleague can't recruit the guy because they have a very sensitive position and they can't expose the fact that they're a CIA officer. But instead, they hand me all of the information, and then I look for some opportunity or occasion to approach this person. Well, in this one specific case, I knew that this guy was going to give a public speech somewhere. So, guess who sits in the front row? Jim. I sit in the front row, I take notes. Afterwards, I go up and I, praise the guy, said what a great talk it was. And I also happen to know that he was quite the gourmand and he loved, wonderful cuisine. So I invited him to a starred restaurant for, about 10 days later when he was flattered to be invited to such a fancy place. And so I went to lunch with the guy, and I knew that he liked jazz. And so I did a lot of study. I like jazz too, but I did not know quite as much as he did about jazz. But I bought some albums like some Miles Davis albums and some Bill Evans albums and things like that, so I could drop into conversation. That the way I relax is I enjoy listening to Miles Davis, the Kind of Blue album, or some of Bill Evans albums, and that I enjoyed good wine because I actually am a wine collector. And he was from a country that produces a lot of excellent wine, so he was also very interested in that. And then one thing led to another, and I found out that he was going through a divorce. In fact, you see a theme here. Headquarters nicknamed me Dr. Divorce after a while because I was always in the orbit of somebody going through some terrible life crisis and then offering
Oh
them a
my God.
life ring. Yeah, offering them a life ring
Yeah.
of financial things, yes, but frequently it was also psychological support because you feel so isolated when you're going through a divorce. And if you have a friend there that'll help you out, and that friend is me, then you're going to also reciprocate and help me out.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, this is a great insights that you have provided all over. I mean, so we are completing the almost a section of the part where how the recruitment process is done, what are the kind of skill set that are needed, and the kind of analogies that can be put towards in terms of recruiting the asset. So we'll be continuing this conversation. It's an exciting conversation. We'll be continuing it in the next episode. So we'll be ending this episode 99. So I kindly request the guest, if they are directly listening to the 100th episode, I would kindly request you to first listen to episode 99 and then proceed with the episode 100 so that you can very well connect with the conversation. Thank you very much.